A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. So I've been thinking about this all week, and I'm not entirely sure if I should be horrified or impressed. Maybe both.
With you on the horrified part, but yeah, there's a certain, I don't want to say elegance, but the technical sophistication of how these systems get built is genuinely remarkable.
Daniel's prompt today is about state-sponsored brainwashing, and specifically, how regimes actually pull this off. We've talked about the IRGC recruiting kids, North Korea's constant threat narratives, and he wants to know the actual mechanics. Oh, and by the way, Minimax M227 is writing our script today. Fun little production note.
Always good to have the friendly AI down the road helping out.
So let's dive in. When we talk about brainwashing or indoctrination at a state level, what are we actually looking at? Because I feel like the word gets thrown around, but what does the mechanism look like?
The mechanism is actually pretty straightforward once you break it down, and that's part of what's unsettling about it. You're dealing with three primary levers: control of information, control of education, and constant threat narrative reinforcement. That's really the triangle.
3 levers. Simple enough.
Now, the interesting thing is, these aren't new techniques. If you look at the research going back to the mid-20th century, there were some deeply unethical experiments run by various intelligence agencies exploring coercive persuasion and what they called psychological deconstruction. The Tavistock Institute also did work in this space, funded by various interests, looking at how you could systematically reshape population beliefs. Most of that research is ethically indefensible, but the frameworks they developed, those became foundational.
So, modern regimes aren't inventing the wheel. They're borrowing heavily from research that probably should have been destroyed.
And what we've seen over the decades is those techniques get refined and adapted. The Soviet Union was arguably the first large-scale laboratory for this. They developed what they called reification, treating citizens as objects to be shaped rather than people with agency.
That word keeps coming up in these contexts, doesn't it? The idea that you're not dealing with a person, you're dealing with a malleable thing.
The psychology behind it is fascinating and horrifying in equal measure. What these systems are doing is essentially exploiting how humans naturally process information and form identity. You can't just tell someone the world is a certain way and have them believe it. You have to create an entire ecosystem that reinforces that narrative from every angle simultaneously.
So when we look at North Korea, for example, they're not just saying we're under threat. They're doing something more comprehensive.
North Korea is actually a masterclass in this, and I mean that clinically. You've got the Juche ideology that permeates everything from kindergarten education to workplace culture. Children learn from their earliest ages that the Kim family is literally divine, that North Korea is a paradise surrounded by enemies who want to destroy them, and that any contact with outside information is spiritually corrupting.
The spiritual corruption part is interesting. That's not just political, that's almost religious.
It's absolutely religious in its structure. You have a creation myth, you have saviors, you have concepts of purity and corruption, you have rituals of devotion. The regime has essentially created a civil religion. And here's the thing about religion that these systems exploit. It provides absolute certainty in a world of uncertainty. When you're facing existential questions, having a framework that says this is simply true, the evidence is everywhere, is psychologically comforting.
So the threat narrative serves multiple purposes.
It does. First, it creates an in-group out-group dynamic where anyone outside the system is potentially dangerous. Second, it justifies the restrictions on your freedom. If enemies are constantly trying to infiltrate and destroy you, of course you can't have unrestricted internet access. Of course you can't travel freely. It's survival. Third, it creates dependency on the state for protection. The regime is the only thing standing between you and annihilation.
That third point is key, isn't it? Because that's where Stockholm Syndrome comes in.
It's related, though I think calling it Stockholm Syndrome specifically is a bit of a simplification. What you're really looking at is trauma bonding, which is a well-documented psychological phenomenon where people develop intense emotional attachments to those who are actually harming them.
And this happens in abusive relationships all the time, not just state-level situations.
The mechanism is similar across contexts. You have intermittent reinforcement, where the abuser alternates between kindness and cruelty in unpredictable ways. The victim never knows when the next good treatment will come, so they become hypervigilant and emotionally dependent on reading the abuser's moods. Over time, they start to believe that if they just do everything right, the cruelty will stop.
Which of course it never does, because the cruelty is the point.
The cruelty serves multiple functions. It keeps you off balance, it demonstrates power, and crucially, it makes the occasional reward feel precious. In North Korea, you might get extra food rations for exceptional loyalty displays. That extra portion feels like grace, like proof that the system recognizes your worth. You become grateful for the scraps.
It's dark.
It is. And this is where the education system becomes so critical. These regimes invest enormous resources in shaping how children think, because children are malleable in ways adults are not. We know from developmental psychology that logical reasoning and critical thinking don't fully mature until the mid-20s. Children and adolescents are much more susceptible to suggestion, much more likely to accept authority claims without questioning them.
We've seen reporting on Azerbaijan textbooks describing Armenians in pretty visceral terms. Fifth graders being taught that their neighbors are literally subhuman.
And that language matters. When you describe an entire group as depraved or rabid or use dehumanizing terminology consistently from childhood, you're not just conveying information, you're creating an emotional reflex. The word itself becomes associated with visceral disgust, and that gut reaction becomes independent of any rational consideration.
So by the time someone is an adult, the belief isn't even something they think about. It's just how they feel.
And this is why deprogramming is so difficult. You're not trying to introduce new information to override old information. You're trying to restructure emotional responses that have been baked in for decades. That's a fundamentally different challenge.
So what does recovery actually look like for someone who manages to get out? Say, a North Korean defector who makes it to South Korea or the United States?
South Korea has actually developed quite sophisticated programs for this. The Hanawon Center provides somewhere between 3 and 6 months of intensive re-education. And I use that word deliberately because they're doing essentially the same thing in reverse, teaching critical thinking, exposing people to outside information gradually, helping them develop the cognitive tools they didn't get in North Korea.
3 to 6 months seems like a short window for decades of conditioning.
It is short, and the results are mixed. Studies suggest that roughly 30 to 40% of defectors experience significant psychological distress even years after resettlement. Depression rates are high, PTSD is common, and there's a phenomenon called guilty freedom, where people feel bad about their own success and happiness because it contradicts the narrative that the world outside is hostile and miserable.
That guilt part is fascinating. So, even when they're safe, their conditioning tells them they shouldn't be.
The mind does not let go of core beliefs easily, especially when those beliefs are tied to survival. If you spend 20 years believing that leaving North Korea would mean death, and now you're eating regular meals and your kids go to school, there's a cognitive dissonance that can be genuinely painful. Part of you keeps waiting for the other shoe to drop.
And some defectors actually go back.
A small number, but yes. Some discover that the adjustment is harder than they expected, that they can't find their footing in a market economy, that they feel like strangers in their own families. Others were genuinely more invested in the ideology than they realized, and some go back for various other reasons. It's complicated.
What about the IRGC situation Daniel mentioned? That's recruiting children, which is younger than the typical defector age we're talking about.
That's where the developmental window becomes so critical. If you're targeting 12-year-olds, you're getting them before their critical reasoning is fully online. You're shaping their foundational worldview. The IRGC has formalized this by essentially creating a parallel education system with summer camps, vocational training, and ideological instruction starting very young.
And the goal is loyalty, not just soldiers.
The goal is a generation that sees the IRGC as a protective force rather than a controlling force. That's a different psychological objective than pure military recruitment. They want these kids to genuinely believe that the IRGC is what stands between Iran and its enemies, that criticizing the IRGC is equivalent to endangering the nation.
So the same threat narrative we talked about with North Korea, but deployed in a society where kids still have some contact with outside information.
Which is actually harder to manage and explains why Iran has to be more heavy-handed with suppression. The internet exists, satellite TV exists, people travel. You can't maintain the complete information bubble that North Korea has. So you have to use additional mechanisms: intimidation, social pressure, making examples of people who step out of line.
Fear is always the backstop, isn't it?
Always. And this is where the psychological research gets genuinely disturbing. Fear is actually one of the most reliable ways to create lasting behavioral change. The amygdala, which processes threat responses, is much faster than the prefrontal cortex, which handles rational analysis. When you're genuinely afraid, you don't think, you react. Over time, even the anticipation of fear becomes aversive enough that people avoid the behaviors that trigger it.
So you train entire populations to fear not just punishment, but the possibility of punishment.
You create what psychologists call avoidance learning. The behavior is not be loyal to the regime. The behavior is avoid the catastrophic outcome. Those are psychologically distinct. The first requires belief. The second just requires fear.
Which explains why even people who privately despise a regime will publicly support it.
And why you get denunciations of family members? Why you get neighbors reporting on neighbors? It's not that everyone has been convinced that this is the right system. It's that everyone has been trained to fear the alternative.
Okay, so let's talk about hope. What does recovery actually look like? And I'm asking both practically and psychologically. Is there a point where someone who spent 20 years in that system can genuinely unpack all of it?
The honest answer is complicated. Full recovery might be too high a bar. The conditioning leaves traces that never fully disappear, but significant functional recovery is absolutely possible. What you're really aiming for is not erasing the old patterns, but building new patterns on top of them that give the person agency and choice.
So it's more like compensation than reversal.
Much more. Think of it like physical therapy after an injury. The original damage doesn't disappear, but you can develop workarounds, strengthen other systems, create new habits. Some neural pathways get reinforced while others gradually weaken.
What are the key factors that actually predict good outcomes?
Age of exposure matters enormously. The earlier you get in, the deeper the conditioning. The later you get out, the more you have to unlearn. After that, social support is probably the single most important factor. People who have communities that validate their experience, that help them make sense of what they've been through, that introduce them to new frameworks without demanding immediate adoption, those people do significantly better.
Language and cultural fluency must play a role too.
A massive role. If you're resettled in a country where you don't speak the language, you're already at a disadvantage. Everything becomes harder. Finding work, building relationships, accessing services, understanding the new society enough to feel like a participant rather than a spectator. Some programs pair defectors with translators and cultural mentors for the first several years specifically to address this.
And economically, if you can't support yourself, that creates its own spiral.
Financial stress compounds, psychological distress. If you're worried every month about making rent, you don't have cognitive bandwidth for the slow, difficult work of restructuring how you think about the world.
So a comprehensive approach that addresses psychological, social, linguistic, and economic needs simultaneously.
The best programs we've seen do exactly that. South Korea's approach is probably the most developed, but there are NGOs in various countries doing impressive work with more limited resources. The key is recognizing that this isn't just a knowledge problem. It's not like these people just don't know the truth. They know the truth intellectually. Their emotional responses haven't caught up.
Because the truth doesn't feel true yet.
And that emotional lag can persist for years. What you're trying to do is create new emotional associations, new experiences that contradict the old patterns and make the new patterns feel real.
This is where things like travel and exposure to diverse communities become therapeutic in a sense.
When you meet people from different backgrounds and they don't match the threat narrative, when you experience hospitality from people the regime told you to fear, when the predicted catastrophe doesn't materialize, those experiences accumulate. They don't instantly rewrite the brain, but they add up over time.
What about the role of identity? Because it seems like these systems don't just teach you what to think, they teach you who you are.
That's a profound point. These systems create what you might call a fortress identity. Being a loyal citizen is not something you do, it's something you are. When that gets challenged, people experience it as an existential threat to the self, not just a difference of opinion.
So recovery has to include some kind of identity reconstruction, not just belief change.
And that identity piece is where many de-radicalization programs fall short. They focus on correcting beliefs, on providing counter-narratives, but they don't adequately address the fundamental question of who you are now that you're not that other thing.
What's the solution there?
I think it requires creating space for people to construct a new identity that incorporates their past without being defined by it. Some defectors find meaning in advocacy, in sharing their story, in helping others going through similar transitions. That can become a new source of purpose and identity.
Others just want to disappear into normal life.
And that's equally valid. Not everyone wants to be a symbol or a teacher. Some people just want to make coffee and raise their kids and not think about this stuff ever again. That doesn't mean they haven't recovered. It means they found a version of normal that works for them.
Are there tools from therapy that seem particularly effective?
Cognitive processing therapy and EMDR have both shown promise. The first helps people examine and restructure the dysfunctional beliefs that were installed. The second helps process traumatic memories in ways that reduce their emotional charge. Neither is a quick fix, but both have documented efficacy.
I imagine medication plays a role for some people too.
For some, absolutely. When anxiety or depression is severe enough that it impairs daily functioning, medication can create the stability needed to engage in the therapeutic work. The goal isn't to medicate away the problem, it's to reduce symptoms enough that the person can participate in their own recovery.
Let me ask you something a little different. How do we evaluate whether these programs are actually working? Because it seems like the metrics could get complicated.
They are complicated. If you measure by belief change, people often update their stated beliefs relatively quickly once they're exposed to contradictory information. But if you measure by emotional response, by behavior, by life outcomes, those changes happen on a much longer timescale and are much harder to quantify.
So, a defector who says all the right things but still flinches when they see a police uniform hasn't necessarily recovered.
And someone who sometimes expresses nostalgia for aspects of their old life but functions well in their new context might actually be doing quite well. The outward conformity doesn't tell you much about internal state.
What would you say to someone listening who's a policymaker or works with refugee populations? What's the one thing you'd want them to understand?
That these people are not broken. They survived. The psychological patterns that help them survive in a hostile environment are not pathological, they're adaptive. The goal of intervention is not to fix them, is to give them new tools for a different environment. There's a respect that has to be at the center of any approach.
And for the average listener who's never been through something like this and hopefully never will, what's the takeaway?
I think understanding how these systems work makes us more resilient against their simpler cousins. Threat narratives, information control, loyalty testing, us versus them framing, these aren't unique to totalitarian states. They show up in cult contexts, in abusive relationships, in political manipulation. Recognizing the pattern is the first step to not being manipulated by it.
We like to think of this as something that happens to other people in other places, but the mechanisms are everywhere.
They really are. And the research from these extreme contexts actually informs our understanding of persuasion and influence in democratic societies too. The principles translate even if the stakes are different.
All right, we should probably start wrapping up. Herman, any final thoughts?
I just want to say that the fact that people do make it out, that recovery is possible, that human beings have this remarkable capacity to adapt and heal, that's not nothing. It matters.
It does. Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping us on track. Big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. This has been My Weird Prompts. If you're enjoying the show, a quick review on your podcast app helps us reach new listeners. Find us at myweirdprompts.com for RSS and all the ways to subscribe. We'll see you next time. This episode was produced using Minimax M2.7. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to